Go.
Hello, I'm Thomas Brigthsworth, and welcome back to Monarchist Minute. Today we have a very special episode for you, as this is our first ever official screen live recording, where you can see all of our beautiful faces, and we actually have a very special guest with us. Mr. Coloumbe here is not only the leading American Catholic historian, and he's an author of many great several books, including Vicars of Christ, Star Spangled Crown, a well-known advocate for Blessed Karl I's canonization, and is a Knight Commander of the Order of St. Sylvester. Mr. Coloumbe, thank you for being on with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Great to be here.
So, Mr. Coloumbe, I wanted to ask as a very basic first question. What exactly got you into monarchism? Was it like just a 1 minute, like it all suddenly clicked, or was it a very, very slow progression?
It was a slow progression in a short time. And what I mean by that is that I came from a family that were very patriotic, but on my father's side, a French Canadian, with a bit of Scots. And my dad very much loved the House of Bourbon. It sent us to Canada centuries ago. And it was very much a Jacobite. Our multiple great-grandfather, Laughlin McKinnon, having fought at Coloumbe and come to Canada in 1772.
Really? I'm a proud Jacobite myself, so that makes my day so much better.
There you go. You see, I was hoping when Prince Charles, as he was, became king, everyone had said he was going to be George VII. But he took Charles III anyway. I thought Charles IV would be great, but it would have been a step too far.
I once made a joke to people that I'm going to go to the next coronation and go next to the Republicans and hold a "Not My King," and then immediately confuse them. They're going to be like, "You support us?" "No, I support this king in Bavaria." Just confuse the heck out of them.
You need his picture under it.
Absolutely.
That would confuse them. But no, seriously though, it was so that was part of it. I mean, my mother too was, for her family, they were very pro-Habsburg, pro-Romanov.
So a pro-Bourbon side and a pro-Habsburg side. How did that work out?
Easily.
Really?
Well, yeah. I mean, how did it work out with Karl and Zita or Louis and Marie Antoinette?
That is true.
Worked out fine, except what was going on around them. But in terms of their own marriages, it was great. And the thing is too, there's a lot more interaction than you would think. Louis XIV's mother, Anne d'Autriche, was actually the reason why the French Canadians are so devoted to Saint Anne. She actually financed the initial shrine at Saint Anne de Beaupré.
Really?
Oh.
Wow.
And there are a lot more interrelationships than you think. What I mean to say is not that made me a monarchist. It meant that I was brought up without the anti-monarchical prejudices.
Right, that's natural in all Americans. Right?
Exactly. So I didn't have those. I mean, my dad was World War II vet, tail gunner against the Japanese, very patriotic American. But I had a certain seeking sympathy for loyalists. And living as we did before I was 6 in Westchester County in Manhattan. And my father, being the amateur historian he was, every Sunday we'd go driving around and see colonial sites and all that after Mass. And every now and then we'd hit a loyalist site. And Dad would say, well, we'd tell the story. But it was always sort of regretful, you know. And then when I got older, and I'm not much older, because I learned at an early age to despise the French Revolution. But I saw at a very young age the interconnection between the American and the French Revolution. At the very least, you wouldn't have had the one without the other. That was the first thing. The second thing was that if that's true, maybe there was more to be said for the loyalists than one thought. But that was not something I really pursued until I was a bit older. Then I'm in high school. And the thing that really pushed me over the edge was, oddly enough, even though I don't have a drop of Greek blood to the best of my knowledge, it was the treatment of King Constantine II in Greece after the overthrow of the Kermes. Now this was a man, bear in mind, who initially, because the idiotic political morons of Greece had brought everything to a standstill, the army overthrows them. Okay. The king is a young man. He's just been king for 3 years. He's in his 20s. What does he do? Well, initially he doesn't do anything. We'll see how it goes. Then he begins putting pressure on the colonels to go back to the Constitution. Well, the colonels, with a certain amount of justice on their side, said, yeah, that's it, go back to the same people that ruled the country in the first place.
Yes.
So you've got this sort of standoff. Well, finally, the king decides to try a coup of his own. But it wasn't that well planned. Fails. And he and his family leave the country. So, for the next 5 years or so, the Greek colonels maintain the fiction that Greece is still a monarchy. But in 1973, they have a kind of a rigged referendum bringing in a republic. So far, so bad. Following year, in 1974, there's a big thing in Cyprus. They get overthrown. And now the politicians come flocking back to the various rocks they've been hiding under. This would have been the time to say, all right, we're back at the Constitution, business as usual. No. We'll have our own plebiscite on the monarchy. Now, see, this was a man who had risked his life with his political creatures scattered away like what they are. Okay? He wasn't allowed to campaign, nor were his supporters. He was allowed one television broadcast from abroad. He wasn't allowed to come back to the country. Really. And then the plebiscite had its foregone conclusion. Greece became a republic, which it is today. And I was so annoyed as a 14-year-old boy at something so patently rigged and stupid.
Yeah.
And I said, you know what? To hell with it. That's what politicians are like. Then I have to say that by and large, the political class are pretty much like that everywhere.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong. When I say this, I don't mean to say they should all be shot and we don't need them. No. What I do say is that, like artists or athletes, the political class, on the one hand, do things the rest of us can't or won't. But on the other hand, and are devoted to it. They're devoted to power the way an athlete is devoted to his sport or an artist to his art. Which, as you know, if you know any of them, very often means their family lives are horrible. They're often not people you want to have to deal with directly.
Absolutely.
Because they're focused on something in a way that you and I can't be.
Absolutely.
Well, you need someone outside of that realm to keep them in their place.
Yes.
Someone in a position to smack them around if they need it.
One of the best arguments for monarchy I've ever heard is one that is based off the family. A king doesn't have to be elected, so therefore there's a lesser incentive and lesser ability to bribe a king specifically to get what you need. One problem we see in America with many politicians who went in with good intentions, you know this better than anyone, is that they need the votes and they need the support, they need the campaign. But unfortunately, other very rich, powerful people say, hey, if you support this specifically evil policy, we will fund you a lot. But in a monarchy, as far as I've seen, that can't happen nearly as much. And that's why the monarch, again, seems to be a lot more unbiased in the fact that he's not bound to any of these.
Well, and beyond that, where a politician only looks, on the one hand, only represents his own party, and on the other, only looks to the next election. Although it's funny, the Archduke Karl from Habsburg made the observation a few years ago that where once politicians only looked ahead as far as the next election, now they look as far ahead as the next press conference. And but everyone's attention span is getting shorter, so I don't see why they should be different. At any rate, the thing was that Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, was asked in 1905 by the then retired American President Teddy Roosevelt, what do you see your role as being? And he said, protecting my peoples from their politicians. Now, again, the king can look forward in a way that the politician can't, partly because he's stuck with it.
Yeah.
You know, look at Queen Elizabeth. My God, she became queen in 52, and she dies 70 years later. Now they don't all live that long. Franz Joseph himself, though, 1848 to 1916, you're stuck with living a long time, and you've got children you want to leave the family business to.
Yeah.
To say nothing of the children of your subjects. So there's an incentive for long-term planning.
Yes, because kind of like what you mentioned about that family business idea, I wrote that down a long time ago. Like if you're a businessman and you know your business is going to be passed down, who are you naturally going to have a higher incentive to make it better for? An elected other CEO who you may or may not know or care about or like, or your son?
Yeah.
And the natural parental instinct, again, that's one of the best arguments for monarchy, is the argument from the family. If every institution, society is in some way based off the family, then perhaps maybe a system of government based off the family is a better option.
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, mind you, it's not perfect any more than anything else is. The question, and this is always a problem, the usual argument between monarchy and republic compares Henry VIII to George Washington.
Yeah.
But
that's not really fair.
No, it's not fair at all.
If you're gonna, I always said this, like we actually did a debate on monarchy versus republic at my university. One thing I tried to make clear and that everyone else eventually agreed to was that if you're gonna try and compare government systems, you can't just, for every bad monarch I can name 2 bad presidents.
Or more.
Exactly. So you have to get at the very root of it. What makes a monarchy? How is the government system flawed or better than the other?
And that too, I mean, basically it would be just as ridiculous for me to say, well, monarchies are better, just compare Adolf Hitler to St. Louis.
Exactly.
Well, okay, that's an argument, but it's not a good one.
That would be a fallacy in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It would be stupid, and nobody would settle for that. But what you have to look at is the totality. And of course, there are monarchies and there are monarchies. I mean, I would not have wanted to live under the Ottoman Sultans or the Qing Empress of China.
That's fair.
But that having been said, notice also that they've never been replaced by anything better. That's the other half of that.
Yeah. Like when Russia, the Tsar was overthrown, and most people, even some relatives of Tsar Nicholas II who still live today, say he wasn't the best monarch, but every single leader who's come after him then has been horribly worse.
And the other thing too, and this is something people forget, you look at Kaiser Wilhelm, you look at Tsar Nicholas, and people would like to stick them with the responsibility for the First World War.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a little different than that. The reason being, let's go back to 1905.
Yes, sir.
I wasn't there, despite what people will tell you. I'm not that old. I know I look it, but not true. I feel it, but all right, move on. But no, in 1905, Wilhelm and Nicholas, who were first cousins and good friends, they went for a cruise in Malta. And when they were done, they signed a treaty of non-aggression and alliance between the two countries. Well, remember, at this point in European history, 1905, you had 2 blocks. You have the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And you've got the Triple Entente, which is France, Great Britain, and Russia. Now, this treaty they signed between them required them also to try to get their respective 2 other allies in on the deal. They were envisaging a sort of sextuple alliance that would maintain peace in Europe indefinitely. So, that was their plan. They get home to their respective capitals, and both their governments immediately disavow the treaty. Which shows you that in 1905, let alone 1914, it was neither Nicholas nor Wilhelm who were dictating policy. All right, let's fast forward, 1914. Well, the other thing I should point out, every set of politicians in Europe in the 2 or 3 decades prior to the war were divided into a peace party and a war party, basically. Now, when I say it was a war party, don't think that they thought, gee, wouldn't it be great to have people killing each other? That's not where they were at. But the problem they faced was that every one of these countries had a lot of severe internal problems.
And a war often helps build the psychological trust.
Precisely.
And if you win a war especially, it's kind of like in the Cold War, there's a weird analogy, but in America, a lot of Americans during the Cold War were so disgruntled. They didn't know what to do, what to believe. They were just kind of like, as I think one person told me, walking dead men. When the American hockey team beat the Soviet hockey team, which was actually a group of their military, it united Americans a lot stronger. And the fact is, none of that should have happened. The Cold War shouldn't have been a thing. But the fact is, when we focused so much on it, we started beating Russia, it did unite to some degree. So there is some truth to that.
There's always, people always jump up and down and get behind the flag when they feel it's threatened.
Absolutely.
Whichever flag it is. But the problem is that they didn't realize what kind of a war they were going to get into. Yeah. They had in mind the Napoleonic War, the Crimean War.
Wars that seemed to have some kind of honor to it.
Not just that, they really didn't do nearly as much damage.
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't fun, believe me, but they were not the soul searing horrors that war became. They didn't realize that was what they were getting into. The Peace Party, however, in every country, thought, that's not really a smart idea. And the leaders of the peace parties in Russia and Austria-Hungary, respectively, with a longtime Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, who was assassinated in 1912, and the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Austria-Hungary, whose death not only caused the war, it also removed from the table the leading opponent of war in the governing circles. So the peace party is finished, and all the heavy politicians are pushing. Serbia, and this too is fun, it's sort of funny in a sick way. Franz Ferdinand was actually assassinated on the orders of the head of the Serbian secret police, a man named Apis, not the Serbian government. But bear in mind that Apis had masterminded the overthrow of the king and murder of the king queen of Serbia in 1903, brought in the new dynasty, Peter I and the Karađorđevićes, and he was a big power. He wasn't someone that people wanted to mess with. Although, eventually the Serbians would execute him themselves after Serbia had been invaded by the Germans and the Austrians during the war. Anyway, so Apis was behind it. The Austrians and Germans suspected that was the case. But the Serbian government faced elections in November. And they didn't want to appear weak.
Yeah.
And lose the election. So, now that having been said, the Austrian demands were actually quite reasonable. So much so that the leader of the war party, Count von Berchtold, the foreign minister, was afraid the Serbians would accept them. Because if they did, he was stuck without a casus belli. And then what would he be? So, I think what you could say, World War I could be laid not at the hands of the monarchs. It can be laid at the feet of the wonderful political classes who then guided the war into its disasters, successfully defeated the attempts of Pope Benedict XV, Blessed Emperor Karl, King Albert of the Belgians, and King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy to bring about peace.
Yeah.
Each and every one of whom attempted so to do. But fortunately, the politicians were there to stop it every time. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff, of course, in Germany, who were more generals. But anyway, they didn't take it over.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's really interesting. Because again, a lot of people, when they think about World War I, a natural response is to blame the monarchs. But at this point in history, these monarchs' powers were getting more and more limited by the day. And that actually brings to another interesting point about monarchy I wanted to bring up with you. So when most Americans think about monarchy, they, again, only think of the absolutist type, like Louis XIV, or etc. But I try to explain to a lot of them that monarchy, just like a republic, is not a one thing.
No.
The American republican system is not the only form. Just like the Nazi Germany form wasn't the only one. There are many different types.
No, and bear in mind, too, that the American government today has far more power over its citizens than Henry VIII or Louis XIV did. So, we live in absolute democracies. Yeah. And if you don't believe me, if you've still got a memory, think back 2 years, or 3 years, or 4 years, into the height of COVID. It was one of my running gags back then. that when they had us put our masks on, they took theirs off. And we were able to see the broad face of modern power in the state. The truth is that the modern state, as it has come to be, as it has evolved, is a far more dictatorial, totalitarian regime than any monarchy that claimed to be Christian that I can think of. Henry VIII had to somehow pretend to abide by the law.
And that's where Parliament got a lot of its power too in history. That was probably, there were many moments in history where Parliament gained more and more, but this was kind of the point where the King and Parliament worked hand in hand.
And when Parliament, well, I mean, the thing is, what Parliament really was, we were always told that it was the voice of the people.
It wasn't.
No, it was the voice of an oligarchy.
Yeah.
I'm going to say something that's going to sound horrible. But the voice of the people usually has very little say in any regime of any kind ever.
One great example is the Roman Republic. I can't remember the exact names, but there were two specific Roman reformers who worked for the plebeians. And the moment their reforms started even getting the tiniest bit popular, they were immediately assassinated.
No. And it's an unfortunate reality, but the reason is very simple. The political classes, or their equivalent, historically, are interested in power in a way in which the normal human being just isn't.
It's kind of interesting, and it reminds me of something Hilaire Belloc once quoted, because in the book I read of his, Louis XIV, a biography, which brilliantly wonderful, it's interesting. In the opening, an academic professor once called Hilaire Belloc ideally monarchist his entire life. One could say that Belloc was ideally Republican his entire life, that Belloc was ideally Republican, but practically monarchist, which is the opposite for a lot of Americans. Many Americans I've met said they're ideally monarchist, but practically Republican, and as Hilaire Belloc famously said, in order to have a good republic, you have to have good Republicans.
Well, fortunately, we don't have those.
Exactly.
But no, the thing with Belloc, he's an interesting character because he was very French, and this is something, believe me, I understand. But he was an outsider.
Yeah.
And of course, he was very English.
He had
and an outsider.
All of both worlds.
He had all of both worlds.
They very much hated each other.
And what's funny about him, the reason why, when it comes to English history, he's spot on. But he had a big problem with French history. He was a relative of Danton, the great revolutionary. Did you all know?
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, wait, that kind of makes sense. I think a while before he wrote his book on Louis XIV, he wrote an article saying Catholics should support the French Revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, again, it comes from his trying to reconcile his religion with his family. And speaking as a Frenchman, I can tell you, I thank God that there were no Coulombes in the French Revolution. We fortunately had made our way to Canada and escaped all that. But it is important to bear in mind when you're examining Belloc. A better guide to the French Revolution than Belloc is another fellow who we can pick up easily enough. In English, Bernard Fay, which looks like Bernard Fay. And it's got an umlaut, that's why it's Fay, really. But yeah. Anyway, it's called Louis XVI or the End of the World. I recommend it very highly. Louis XVI himself, was again another interesting character because
he's much more complex than your average historian, Catholic or regular high school teacher would make him out to be.
But and in a real sense, he's the father of our country as much or more than George Washington.
Really?
Yes. Because you got to bear in mind, had France not entered the war, the rebellion would have been crushed.
That's why George Washington fought the way he did, we were told, is to wait until a major ally like France would come in.
Precisely. And that is why Sir William Howe, who was a Whig and an opponent of George III, allowed Washington to escape 3 times. Whereas the revolution would have been over had it not done so.
Yeah.
Well, the thing with Louis XVI was that in 1774 he becomes king. He inherits a country that's in bad shape financially.
Absolutely.
Bear in mind, the French had fought the British in the 1680s, the War of the Grand Alliance, which with us was called King William's War.
Oh, yeah.
Then the Spanish Succession, which we call Queen Anne's War. The Austrian Succession, which we call King George's War. And then the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War.
Yes.
Now, these are all world wars in the age of sail, but they were. And what would happen in each one of them is the French might outfight and outgeneral the British, but they always ran out of money. And that is what would inevitably bring them to the table. Well, Louis XVI becomes king in 1774, immediately begins a bunch of military and financial reforms.
And apparently he called the French Diet, I believe that's what's called, if I can remember, for the first time maybe 600, 400 years.
Well, that came later for a very specific reason. It kind of got out of control.
Yeah.
But that would count. But because of the French Revolution, or the American Revolution. So the 4 years he's king, before they decided to join the revolution, his reforms succeed so well that in the end, they're able to win the War of the Revolution. The last battle of which, incidentally, took place in India, not Yorktown.
Really?
Yeah. So he wins the war, but at a terrible cost. France is bankrupt. Now that itself wouldn't have been too much of a problem, because, we can get by for a while and build things up. But 3 years after the war ended, or I could do this, 1788, 5 years, there was a volcano that exploded in Iceland and killed a lot of the crops in France. And the result was a terrible famine called the Great Hunger. Now normally, the king would have emptied the royal granaries or got grain on credit.
But he didn't have any money.
He didn't have any money. So that was why he first called the Assembly of Notables, and when that didn't come up with anything useful, for the first time in 250 years, he called the Estates General. And that led to directly to the French Revolution.
Wow. No, it's interesting. You clearly know so much about monarchical history, more than probably anyone I've ever met or seen in academia. That leads to a little bit of an off-topic question. When you have, I hate to use the word, but came out as a monarchist, was there any backlash in academia? Were you ostracized or just looked down upon? Or
I've never been an academic, so that wasn't a problem. No, there wasn't much of a thing. I mean, when I was at college, I went first to a military junior college called, by that time I was calling myself a monarchist already, called the Mexico Military Institute in beautiful Roswell, New Mexico. And to answer the inevitable question.
Will you defend the Constitution?
No, I certainly swore that.
Yeah.
I swore the oath. But no, I say when people find out I've been to Roswell for college, they inevitably say, what about the UFO that crashed? And my answer is always, I hate that. People always ask about the one that crashed. They never ask about the one that fulfilled its mission. They never ask another question after that. But seriously, what's funny is I get letters now from classmates.
Really?
Asking me, how did you know the way things were going to go? And I had to tell them something I knew like a prophet.
Yeah.
It's that.
Well, just critical thinking, the reasoning in a way.
Critical thinking, a bit of historical knowledge, and it's pretty. It's like people ask me, because back in 2016, I made a comment about what would happen if we had another a worldwide pandemic. People said, "How did you know it was coming?" I didn't know it was coming. If such a thing would happen, given the high rate of incompetence in world leadership, you're going to get a stupid reaction.
It's kind of like that old saying, like critical thinking, like what could possibly happen. History doesn't repeat itself in it, but it rhymes. If you study math, you can eventually find out naturally how the equations are going to end. Same with history.
I mean, you won't get the specifics, but you'll get a basic idea. So at any rate, I was 2 years at the Institute, and then I went, it was a military junior college, so it was just a 2-year school. And then I went on to Cal State Northridge, majored in frat life, minored in political science. And that was the whole of my college education until I went off to the ITI.
What did you major in at the ITI by any chance?
Big one.
What did you major in the ITI?
Sacred theology.
Nice.
And I just graduated 2 years ago.
Congratulations. That was why I thought you were a doctor. I thought I saw on the post was a doctorate. That was probably my bad.
No, I'm an STM, a Master of Sacred Theology.
Nice.
But, no, most of my life has been spent as a writer and a journalist. Not an academic at all. And in that area, has there been any doubt? No, there isn't, because writers and journalists tend to, I'm not speaking about in terms of how they write and what you're going to see in the media, but how they tend to be as individuals. Tend to be much, much more tolerant of, shall we say, minority opinions than other people, simply because, number one, they don't trust their own craft. I mean, Sam Donaldson went to New Mexico Road History. You probably don't know who that is, but
unfortunately don't.
Don't worry about it. He was a newscaster in my far-off teenage years. I was your age. Mm-hmm. And I met him at an NMI alumni thing. Now, all during Reagan's years, he would attack Reagan constantly. And I finally meet the man face to face. And Reagan's still president at this time. And I said, so Mr. Donaldson, what, like you speaking to me, and I said, what do you really think of President Reagan? He said, oh, it's great. And he was quite drunk at the time he spoke. Oh, it's great. That's President Obama down there. I looked at him and I said, we wouldn't get that impression that you feel that way. What you say about him, every night. I was, oh gosh, that's just TV. You don't believe that crap, do you? And I was like, so the whole thing about fake news is something that if you have anything to do with media, you understand it goes back a long way.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, so what I guess what I'm trying to say is I never had really too much trouble in that sphere, because writers and journalists as well, artists are used to minority opinions.
Fair. No, I'm a theology history major because I love the idea of viewing history. I think Joseph de Maistre once said it, sub specie aeternitatis, viewing history from the aspect of eternity. Everything has some kind of divine providence. When it comes to the French Revolution, he's probably one of my favorite writers, Joseph de Maistre.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I have his book at home on the Pope, and I basically take that view of the papacy. It's really wonderful.
Well, de Maistre was really an amazing fellow. He gets a bad rap for several reasons today, but the truth is, he had a bird's eye view of everything that was going on. Yeah. And of course, he was not a defender of absolute monarchy as it come to be.
Absolutely.
He was much more in favor of the decentralized medieval version. And I do this in quotation marks because it's a style of monarchy that's applicable to any period, really.
Yeah.
And that is, well, in my own research, my own writing, I've reduced, for want of a better word, I don't have a simple word for it, traditional monarchy, to 5 points. Looking at the Carlists in Spain, the Miguelists in Portugal, the Jacobites, and all sorts of groups that were Catholic and or Christian, and trying to see what they had in common. There are 5 points that they all seem to have in common. The first is the altar, which is the idea that the church should set the tone of society, grant legitimacy, and legitimate authority. The second is the throne, which is a monarch who has sufficient power to protect his people from their politicians, is hemmed in by the church and by tradition.
Like always that common quote of we need a union or a working together of throne and altar. Exactly.
The third, local liberties, provincial rights, what we today would call subsidiarity. The fourth is the idea, in earlier days we would speak of the nation as a country, the country rather than the nation as a family.
Solidarity?
Solidarity. Solidarity, precisely right. The idea of class collaboration. And in the interwar period, just before, they came up with all sorts of ism names, distributism, corporatism.
That's really interesting because my main study is political theology. Like how doctrinally should church and state work together? What's the church said about it? Those basically like 4 out of 5 of those principles I laid out in that debate. Not ever seeing that. The idea of all Catholic theology, political theology, stems around 5 basic points: recognition of the authority of Christ overall, recognition of the authority of the church, the unity and stability of government, which is the unity and stability of government, protection of local liberties and rights, and the defense of not only the family structure but the working together society. I summed it up as Christ, author, throne, subsidiarity, and solidarity. So that just gave me a flashback. I didn't even know this was something written.
Well, now you know. Now, in my model, Christ and the church get fused, and the 5th is actually the notion of the Christian nations, the Catholic nations, being, in some sense, a unit. The Respublica Christiana, Christendom, Abendland, Reichsidee, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask, since we're talking about religion, specifically relating to the monarchy, we have, in the Monarchists of America, I'm head of the ideology chair, the department, and we're debating about how should religion relate to the monarchy. Because I showed them, and I think they agreed, that there's never been a purely secular monarchy. Like when Hobbesian monarchy doesn't exist. It's purely free. There's no monarch without some level of religiosity, or even without a hint of divine right. But the major debate is, and you actually addressed this in Star Spangled Crown, that because of the Christian cultural diversity of America, how could the monarch show not only be of one denomination, but how can he protect the others? And if, for example, he's a Catholic monarch, well, in the words of one bishop, it's no secret that Catholics want to convert America. And America this day still has a relatively anti-Catholic bias.
Yeah.
And that leads to a whole different thing. A lot of the members of the Monarchists of America, because we're not explicitly Catholic, we're a Christian organization, say that if anything, we're going to have a Protestant monarchy. Now, I've also seen other people say, like, a monarchist movement that's not Catholic is going to fail no matter what. What would be your take on that? Because you talk about in Star Spangled Crown that a Catholic monarchy could very well work. But nonetheless, this is still a concern, like how would it? And how much could the state, specifically the throne, work with the church?
Well, I mean, this is part of the problem, actually, because we're used to religiously diverse monarchies only because of a long period of devolution, you might say. In Star Spangled Crown, basically the king faced the same sort of situation that James II did in Great Britain, that Franz Joseph did. You know, it's interesting, but the Emperor of Austria and the kings of Bavaria, Saxony, and Bavaria and Saxony, all 3 were Catholic, but they were also heads of the Protestant church in their specific countries, which is something people don't realize. They appointed the Protestant bishops and so forth. They managed. In the case of Star Spangled Crown, what I did was I had a Catholic king who, nevertheless, he basically applied what the Constitution was at the very beginning, which was that he given, on the one hand, a state could determine an established church. There could not be a single established church for the United States, but every state could have, or not, an established church. If they did have an established church, no one could be discriminated against for not belonging to it. And the concrete example I gave of this was that in the first state to take advantage of this new law was Utah, which immediately made the Mormons the state church. It said, but from that time to this, no Mormon has ever been appointed governor of Utah. So you would have to have some sort of weird, unwieldy balance. But the problem with Protestantism is that it's, you can't really define it. And, you end up, I mean, as you look at Britain today, the Church of England, as it gets feebler and feebler.
And their theologies all over the place. You have High Church, Anglo-Catholics, all the way to Reformed Calvinists.
Yeah, and that's within the established church, let alone outside of it. And how that's going to end up, who knows? However, all that having been said, I think it's highly unlikely that anything like what I described as Star Spangled Crown ever come to pass. Remember, the Catholic monarchy was not designed.
Yeah, it organically developed. Exactly.
And it developed from the alteration of institutions as the people came into the faith. So you had the Roman Empire first convert. Well, actually, take that back. 303, you had Armenia. The kings, princes, peasants, and everyone else come into the church. Nubia, Ethiopia, Georgia, not the real one in the South, in the American South, the phony one in Blank State. They all came into the church en masse, and then the Roman Empire. Over time, what we call Christendom developed as the mass conversions organically altered the institutions. I think for anything to endure for a long time, it has to be along those lines. But having said that, I also know that sometimes you have weird mass changes. So while I don't think anything remotely like Star Spangled Crown will come to pass, if it does,
I wouldn't complain if it did.
No, I get a lot of people writing me, wishing, gee, I finished the book thinking, why can't it really be that way? Well,
I would say it's probably the most practical, using it loosely here, way it could happen.
And well, see, also, I wrote that book with two things in mind. One, it had been pointed out to me that there was not a body of Catholic monarchism per se, but a lot of monarchisms plural. And so, using America as a tabula rasa, I was looking to see what defined Catholic monarchy in the abstract.
Yes, sir.
But the second, which is like the first, was the idea of an American patriotism that was not rooted in the so-called ideology of the country. I mean, the reason why we've been able to function so well is that the Founding Fathers replaced the monarchy, really, the allure of monarchy, the charism of monarchy, with a sort of American civil religion, which everybody could belong to, and sort of deified the country. And this is rooted in a moral consensus. Most people thought the same things were right and wrong. 1960s come along, the moral consensus is broken.
Out the window.
Yeah. And so the religion of the country withered. And then in recent years, just as Calvinism flips into Unitarianism, American exceptionalism flipped into wokery. So we went from being the shining city on the hill, the last best hope.
Americanism.
All that. The last best hope of mankind. We flip it. And now we're the worst country that ever lived. Founded in genocide and built on slavery. Well, neither of those are true. But the problem you have is that for so many Americans, the idea of patriotism, of love of country, not because it's the greatest thing that ever was, but simply because it's our country. It doesn't need to be wonderful.
What's interesting about that is, I just want to make sure very quickly, doing good on time? Okay. So one interesting thing I thought of, when people say being a monarchist in America is unpatriotic, I find that kind of odd, because the reason I am monarchist in America is because I love America. Patriotism as a virtue falls again under justice. You give your nation what's due. And if I love America, and love is to will the good of another, and I truly believe monarchy is the best form of government, even for America, why wouldn't I want it to be monarchist? Why wouldn't I want America to be a monarchy if I truly believe it's the best for it?
Well, indeed. Similarly, the Catholic is faced with that issue. And for the Catholic American, just like for the Catholic Indian or the Catholic Japanese, wanting his country to come into the church en masse, the conversion of his country, is the highest form of patriotism he can have. I mean, otherwise, Orestes Bronson in Catholicity, Necessary for Popular Liberty, way back in 1845, wrote that the United States would not survive long. It might be, he was talking about centuries. So, for him, the 250 years that we've had in the United States were nothing.
Yeah.
Because he was, the standard, well thought out view of history and life. He did not feel that if the United States, he did not feel the United States could survive longer than a few centuries if they did not convert.
Yes, it's kind of that really hard truth that any government system, any nation, no matter whether it's a monarchy, a republic, or a pure democracy, or a dictatorship, if it strays away from the true faith, it's naturally going to start corrupting and collapsing little by little into nothingness.
Well, it will fall apart. And the thing to bear in mind, too, I wrote an article called, I think it was Disembodied Church and Zombie State. And in there I made the point, I made it elsewhere, but that one comes to mind. There's really no such thing as separation of church and state.
Absolutely, because there's no real true separation of body and soul
until
after death, and then eventually they come together.
And there's no confessionally neutral state. Every state has the equivalent of state church. Now, it might not be religious. The Soviet Union was communism.
France had the cult of reason.
Exactly. And we have this weird, dribbling, whatever it is we have. But that's our state religion. And of course, every state religion has its heresies. It punishes those who don't, to a degree, that don't go along, and so on. So the question is not shall we have an established church?
It's what it should be.
Precisely. It's not shall we have a ruling class, but what will the nature of that ruling class be?
Yes, two things relating to that. I remember, because again, I absolutely agree with that. Church and state can never be fully separated. It's actually impossible for our human nature. It's like Pope Leo XIII famously said, the state without a church is like a body without a soul. Church without a state is like a soul without a body. But what's interesting, I think it's one of the arguments a lot of people, if they look through history, can agree on. It's called the iron law of oligarchy, which is a sociological theory, and I think it's pretty true. States that no matter how much you try to divide power and authority, eventually at some point it's all going to be in the hands of a fewer one. And I think we've seen this throughout history. So my basic logic is, if this is an inevitable reality, that power is inevitably going to be in the hands of fewer one, then we should do our best to try and make sure the fewer one who has that power and authority uses it well, has a system in which they can be incentivized to use it well.
Yeah, very true. The other thing too, just randomly thinking, you recall, of course, when Aristotle and St. Thomas taught that there were three good kinds of government.
Monarchy, aristocracy, and politia.
Exactly.
Yes.
Which
the three
good kinds. And then they had three evil twins.
Tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Because, fun fact for anyone watching, democracy traditionally means, if you look at the Greek etymology, bad rule by many. Rule by dumb mob, basically, in the Greek context.
Right, it's mob rule, whereas the politia was the rule by the majority of the stakeholders, we would say.
But even the politia was never meant to last forever.
Well, no, but here's the funny thing. They also taught that the very best kind of government was mixed, which had all three of the three good kinds. And for them, the king of the estates summed that up in the medieval format.
And they always do that afterwards. They say, St. Robert Bellarmine actually talks about this in his De Consideratationis. He writes about specifically the papacy, but what government system is the best and why the papacy should be that monarchy. He writes that in an unfallen world, pure monarchy would be the best form. Since we're in a fallen world, temporal monarchy should be a mixture of all of them. But I think, if I can remember back, he goes using that pure monarchy to relate it back to the papacy.
Well, there he goes about monarchy as the best form of government. But, which is funny how often people quote him against it, but never mind.
Sir Robert Filmer does that.
Yeah, but the thing that really hits me is that none of them, not Aquinas, not Augustine, not Bell, ever came up with the notion of a mixed government of the three worst kinds. We moderns have achieved that. We have a mixed government that combines tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule.
No, I saw this actually. Someone took, really out of context, Thomas Aquinas' De Regna, specifically the different structures of it. the three perfect mixture, and they somehow compared each one of them to the three separate branches of government. Now I had to do like a double take. It was like, this doesn't seem like it makes sense.
It doesn't, but that's okay. If he felt good about himself, that's what counts. But no, I mean, as I say, none of these great writers of the past ever came up with the notion of a mixed government with three bad guys.
Because
we did.
Exactly, they wouldn't want to. I have my opinion. I wouldn't want to give
John
Calvin that idea.
The very fact that we have it shows it was great. Because we're living today, it means we're smarter than those dead people.
For sure. No, it's interesting because, like, again, the reason Thomas Aquinas thought tyranny was the worst form is because I believe he's using Aristotelian metaphysics, the best form, if monarchy is truly the best form, then its antithesis has to be the worst. But that is an actually interesting thing I've never thought of, the idea of all three together.
All three bad governments. We have it. We've achieved it. Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, totally.
I'm proud.
We hit a new low in humanity, I'll say that much.
Well, don't worry. There's always room to go lower.
Unfortunately true. No, it's really, really interesting. I'm trying to remember what I was about to ask. Crud. I had something on my mind here. Actually, if I may ask, I looked on your not your biography, but on your Wikipedia page, which I've learned never to trust again. It says you are a representative of the International Monarchist League, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yes. So, one issue that I think gets thrown onto monarchists, because there's a lot of bad monarchists out there. Like some who support revolution in order to have a monarchy, which feels like it's turning everything on its head. What would be, if they are watching right now, your recommendation to them who's saying, waiting too long, trying to hope that we can slowly grow into monarchy, it takes too long, we need to have a revolution if it's ever going to be possible? What would you say to them?
I would say to them that when you're young, it's easy to want immediate change right now. And there's nothing more annoying than some old duffer telling you, oh, well, you really ought to relax. Just wait. You'll see. I mean, I know it annoyed me. And now I am an old duffer. And I've seen rapid change. And I've seen all kinds of fun things. You bet. Lenin, I don't mind quoting Lenin, when he knows what he's talking about, said there are decades where nothing happens. And there are weeks where decades happen. I've seen that in my own life. Be patient. Learn what it is you're in favor of. There's a lot of people, especially today, realize that there's a terrible problem with the West, with the planet, with society. But they don't know what it is. Those who think they know what it is, smaller number. And then of those who have any idea that there might be a solution, smaller number yet. Try to know what you're talking about. Train yourself, learn everything you can, all the skills you can. Because ultimately the system we have is unsustainable. It will collapse. Woe to him by whom it collapses, frankly. But collapse it will. So we've got to be ready when it does. I hope I don't see it, because I've seen enough.
I think if I had to make one quick response, one quick answer, it would be, if there are monarchists who believe that we need to have a revolution, we need to have immediate change, I would simply say to them, you have less patience than a medieval peasant who worked his whole life so that 3 generations down the line they could see a beautiful cathedral.
Well, and also you got to bear something else in mind, and that is the monarchies that one points to were not built in a day, as we said earlier.
Yeah.
There were organic developments. To try to bring in a monarchy by revolution is kind of goes against the whole point. It's squaring the circle, It's the round peg in the square hole.
It's kind of like an ends justifying the means kind of thing.
Yeah.
We argue so much that organic development is important, then cutting that off even for America will only do more harm.
And, you know, our country is actually quite young. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution starting this year. 250 years is much. In that time, we went from 13 little colonies to a colossus that bestrides the globe.
The international hegemon.
Indeed. Will we still be that in 250 years? I pray God is still around in some form or another. As I say, do the best you can where you are right now. You know? Learn things, not just book learning, although that's very important, but learn how to deal with people. Learn how to organize. One of the best things you can do, believe it or not, is local volunteering where you are, and useful things. Historical preservation, conservation, apolitical stuff. The Chamber of Commerce, the Sugar League. Things that will give you experience in working with people and getting things accomplished, getting things done that in and of themselves are actually useful and good for the community. Because not only will you pick up important skills in case things go south in your time, you'll also meet people who wonder, well, gee, why are you so good at what we're doing this? Why do you do it?
And you will truly be, in a way, I hate to use it a little out of context, but Plato's man, growing in virtue constantly so you can make your nation better, little by little. Also, I think we have a little bit more time. I'd like to ask maybe one or two more questions, if that's okay. So, thank you for addressing the audience about that specific issue. I think there's one more that needs to be addressed specifically for Catholic monarchists. And that is the idea. So you have many Catholic theocratic monarchists, such as myself, online, who have slowly, or actually I would say very quickly, more and more have gone down. Extremism is an overused word, but actual extremism. And I tend to attribute it, like for example, you have many who are unironically, unequivocally anti-Semitic. You have many who say the church was wrong to stop this thing. I've actually seen many who says kings were right to disobey the Pope in matters of the Inquisition, so on and so forth. And they support many, again, the list could go on and on. This is one issue I have to deal with as a Catholic theocratic monarchist. I think the issue can relate to a lack of prayer life. I always tell people to not study politics unless your prayer life is in check, because you will eventually forget that the state is a means to an end, which is heaven, not an end in and of itself.
It is a means to an end. Of course, there's also something else to bear in mind. It's definitely a means to an end. And if you don't have a prayer life, anything you do will be spoiled one way or the other. I don't care if it's baking or being a professional manicurist. But there's something else that has to be borne in mind too, and that is that it's easy to react violently against something that's wrong and become equally wrong.
Two extreme vices and still vices nonetheless.
Precisely. Nestorianism versus Monophysitism. But in this question of church and state, I look at the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs being the pro-papal power, the Ghibellines being the pro-imperial power. Ultimately, in the end, the Guelphs won. The empire was destroyed, and the result was disaster. But in the East, amongst our Orthodox brethren, equivalently, the Ghibellines won, and the Guelphs were destroyed, and so the autonomy of the church was destroyed, and the result was a different kind of disaster. So maybe the Guelph and Ghibelline impulses were really meant to dwell in creative tension. I mean, on the one hand, you couldn't have a proper Holy Roman Emperor without the Pope crowning him. On the other hand, the Holy Roman Emperor convoked the ecumenical councils until Trent as well, but then after that, no more emperor. And the emperor of the kings of France and Spain had the right to veto a single candidate at a conclave. It's a balance. An unruly balance, very much like the relationship between men and women. But necessary that both sides do their role even though there's friction, even though it's messy, because if either side wins,
they both lose.
Exactly.
And I think that's where we can about end it. I think we should end in a quick prayer, and then we'll call off in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Saint Louis IX of France.
Pray for us.
Saint Henry II of the Empire.
Pray for us.
Blessed Karl I of Austria.
Pray for
In
us.
the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, this is Monarchist Minute. I am your host, Thomas Brigthsworth. Mr. Coloumbe, thank you for having me.
Thank you, man.
God bless.